Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session on what does Brexit mean for the UK's net zero plans. My name is Mike Bradshaw, and I'm the co-director of the UK Energy Research Centre, UKERC, and also Professor of Global Energy at Warwick Business School. This seminar today is based on a project which is funded by UKERC and a joint effort between the Politics and International Studies Department at the University of Warwick and Chatham House. So we have three speakers and hopefully a lot of questions to get through in the coming 60 minutes. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time dwelling on the bios of each speaker. And also there's a summary document which I think you used when you signed up, including a link to the briefing document which can be found on the UKERC website. So our first speaker then is Jill Rutter. She is a senior research fellow of the UK in a Changing Europe and was previously the program director at the Institute of Government, directing organisations' work on policymaking and Brexit. If you can put questions into the chat box as we go along, we'll pick them at the end when we've heard from all three speakers. So Jill, the floor is yours.
Okay, that was slightly quicker than I expected. Relevantly as well, I was also a co-author of the Institute for Government's report last year on how the UK should get to think about getting to net zero if the UK government is serious about that target. So what I'm going to do today, though, is talk a bit about where we are in UK-EU relations and what that might mean. Particularly, I'm looking at the COP, but we can pick up later in the conversation what that means for domestic policy if we want to do that. So where are we on relations between the UK and the EU at the moment? Well, you might say you've seen all the briefing about sausages, the sort of slideshow in Cornwall, the sort of fractiousness between Boris Johnson and President Macron. You might think, well, things are in a very, very bad place. But actually, let's look on some of the positive side. The key first point is that we have actually settled, though it may not feel like it at the moment, at least the broad parameters of our future relationship with the European Union. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement is now fully in force and fully ratified, and there have been movements to set up all the very complex architecture between the UK and the EU that sits below that. So the Partnership Council had a rather low-key meeting in the run-up to the G7, so overshadowed by the meeting of the Joint Committee on the Withdrawal Agreement, and all those subcommittees, specialised committees that are designed to put flesh on the bones of the agreement that was reached on December 24th last year are being established, though with a bit of an omerta, we're apparently not going to be told who's chairing what and things like that. One of those, though, I think we'll be looking at environmental issues. We've seen from the EU side going right to the wire, but favourable nonetheless, a decision on data adequacy coming down. Now, that was something where the Trade and Cooperation Agreement had a 6-month provisional decision. Those of you who can count 6 months from the beginning of the year will note that that decision was about to expire tomorrow. The EU has made that a full decision, I think, yesterday. So going down to the wire, but positive nonetheless, but with conditions, because the UK is still not, I think it's fair to say, a trusted special partner of the European Union. Maros Šefčovič yesterday was holding out, when he was talking to the Northern Ireland Assembly, was holding out the prospect that the EU would indeed agree to the UK's request to extend the grace period on, yes, chilled meats, but also other things. So although the Northern Ireland Protocol is still very fraught, it's a bit less fraught than it might have been. And I think both sides recognise that it's neither of their interests to be in a really, really bad place, just as Northern Ireland heads into the marching season. So what have we got with the relationship with the EU? We've still got a relationship that both sides are feeling their way. The UK is still obviously wanting to make the case that it was sensible to leave, that it doesn't need the EU. We have a relationship which, if you saw David Frost speak at UK and the Changing Europe last week, you'll know is based predominantly on regaining regulatory autonomy and sovereignty, and has sacrificed quite a lot in that trading relationship for that autonomy and sovereignty. And indeed, and I think this is relevant to talking about UK-EU cooperation on climate, very specifically, the UK made absolutely clear under the Johnson government, a contrast to the May government, that it did not want structured cooperation around wider issues on foreign policy and things like that. So there's no formal structure for discussing, for example, international approaches to climate change, which might be used. So that's where we are on the wider relationship. There are some provisions about climate in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, but they may be advanced for a Trade and Cooperation Agreement, but they're not going to drive action as such. And the UK, on the thing it could have done, and indeed was advised by the Climate Change Committee could have advantages, has set up its own emissions trading scheme and seems pretty lukewarm about linking into the EU scheme. But, what does the UK need to do? It needs to make a success of COP26. Its pride itself, it's on being a leader on climate change. And indeed, the Climate Change Act from 2008 is one of the things, bits of institutional innovation the UK can genuinely point to as being world-beating, one of the government's favourite phrases. It needs a big success at COP26, not least because it's positioned itself as a leader on net zero, but also because this is the first big outing after the G7 for its big global Britain agenda. And frankly, it won't have as good a year as 2021 for burnishing its global Britain credentials, because it's actually managed to get bigger seats at the top table as a post-exit country, because it's had the G7 presidency and COP26 coming up. It needs to cooperate, though, in order to deliver a success there. It needs to cooperate particularly with the Italians, because you'll remember one of the things the G7 did on climate change was hand the baton over to the G20, and the Italians are chairing the G20. G20 actually is a much better representation of the countries you need on board than the G7 does. For successful climate change, they're also chairing the pre-COP meeting in the run-up to Glasgow. And they need to work constructively with the EU. Those of you that know how climate change negotiations work know that the UK used to be a really major player in the EU coordinated approach on climate change, international climate. Chatham House, I think, has secured some of Pete Bett's time. Pete used to be a really and much appreciated player there, used to be at our business department, actually went whatever department was leading on climate change at the time, but he was a bit of a constant. So we do need to cooperate with the EU to deliver a result. What does that mean? I'm sure other speakers will come on to this, but I think one of the things that is quite important is the UK and the EU, insofar as possible, need to insulate the COP and climate change from those Brexit tensions. It seems quite useful. There seems to be actually a rather good relationship going on between Alex Sharma, the UK's COP president, and Frans Timmermans, the relevant European Commission VP. And it doesn't all have to be refracted through that quite combative, quite scratchy relationship between Boris Johnson or David Frost and Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel. I think there needs to be a case for sort of positive bilateral trilateralism in the preparations. The European Policy, EPC, whatever they stand for, European Policy Committee, no, that's not what they stand for. The Fabian Zuleg's organisation in Brussels have suggested that actually maybe the EU should be positive and try and set up some sort of trilateralism between the EU, the US, and rather than exclude the UK, should invite the UK in. I think the questions for both sides are, is the EU willing to let the UK have a big success in Glasgow? The world sort of needs it, but is it allowed to, can it cope with seeing the UK make a success of that? We have to remember there's a lot of domestic politics at play on Brexit being seen to be a failure. And is the UK equally prepared to acknowledge that the EU and the Italian government have played a positive role? So I'm going to leave it there and pass the baton back to Mike.
Thank you very much. A kind of status report on where we are at the moment and what we need to do in the coming months in what is going to be a very important year for global Britain, as you said. So I'm delighted to introduce our second speaker, Amelia Hadfield, who is probably known to many, given that she's been a long-term commentator on EU relations and EU issues. She's relatively recently moved jobs. She's now at the University of Surrey, where she moved in January 2019 to become head of the Department of Politics and chair in European International Affairs. And now she occupies the even more lofty position of Dean of International at the University of Surrey, leading the International Engagement Office. And of course, prior to moving to Surrey, she was at the University of Canterbury. So I think Amelia is going to flesh out some of the detail around the energy and climate perspective in this broader set of relations. So Amelia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you for that very warm introduction. And my thanks to you, Kirk, and obviously to Chatham House as well for putting this event together. So yeah, exactly as Jill said, we have settled to a large part our relationship with the European Union. So let me just kind of whip through the TCA and just see what it said specifically about energy and about climate change. The agreement, for those of you, of course, who've read it in detailed fashion, and possibly for those who haven't, contains some very extensive references to the two sides' shared commitment to climate action. And I think this is an area which, as Jill said, is likely to see, I hope, both sides working together for many, many years to come. I think the wording is very important. Those of you who are lawyers or perhaps closet lawyers should keep a close eye on this. Certainly the word climate is peppered liberally throughout the TCA. It's used 51 times in the final document. Less mention, I think, of Paris agreements and emissions, and climate change is referred to, interestingly, as an existential threat to humanity. And indeed, the agreement includes commitments to maintaining and striving to increase each party's climate level of protection, which is defined as 40% economy-wide reduction in emissions by 2030 in the EU. With the UK meeting its share of this target. Now that target is slightly out of date actually, because it's based on the EU's first NDC, nationally determined contribution, put together under the 2015 Paris Agreement. And it doesn't actually reflect the latest version, which was raised to 55% reductions. But that was only agreed in December. And as this only, the TCA only came out in December, there may be scope for a refresh on that. And similarly, the UK's own recently updated target of 68% reduction from 1990 levels isn't referenced. However, I think there's good news because the greater ambition, I think, is reflected by both parties as they reaffirm their ambition of achieving economy-wide climate neutrality by 2050. So that's the big top line, economy-wide climate neutrality by 2050, referencing their respective net zero targets. Again, the language is very important. The fight against climate change, quote unquote, is deemed within the treaty as an essential element of the agreement. Now, for those of you who enjoy treaties, as I do, that's unusual. That's an essential element, in fact, is a status. That's a very high bar. That's generally associated to core principles like human rights, the rule of law, and defense of fundamental freedoms. So that's very key. I think, materially defeating the object and purpose of the Paris Agreement is mentioned specifically as an example of a failure to fulfill this essential element. So if either party were to somehow renege on its obligations under Paris, the entire Brexit trading agreement could be suspended, and that's certainly not what either side wants as well. So in my view, although the agreement is not better than EU membership or indeed an association agreement, it is in fact the most advanced climate cooperation structure, certainly for a free trade agreement, which is certainly unusual. Climate it's no longer a must-have or even a nice-to-have. It's a core part, a core fundamental part that defines the relationship of the two sides. Looking at the way in which key topics are sewn into it, certainly the emissions associated with traded products, energy ties between nations, and the issue of how do you cap carbon, price carbon, carbon leakage. All of these mean that for the first time, climate action and trade are inextricably linked in a very well-known trade text, the UK-EU trade text. And the commitments that sort of discuss the binding of those together, I think are very, very important. So commitments to promoting the mutual supportiveness of trade and climate policies together mean that you're getting, references to removing obstacles to trade in relevant goods like renewable energy and energy efficient products. So a boost on green goods and a boost on green trade deals as a whole. Again, I think the strong climate language helps to ensure that standards hopefully won't slip for either party. I think there's good news here and possibly not great news. The good news is, with any luck, the TCA, at least for the Brits, maybe helps set high standards at this stage that could have a positive knock-on effect around the world. At the same time, as Jill referenced, and she's quite right, the UK is continuing to push itself away from the European Union in its preferred language, the sort of sovereignty first rhetoric, regaining regulatory autonomy, even if it comes at some price. And there are therefore, I think, very real concerns about the maintenance of high standards as written in the future as well. Let's remember that EU laws have effectively been copied and pasted, or retained, if you like, into UK law. But that is not the end of the story. Retained law is, if it's not adequately looked at and monitored and updated, there's a very real risk that it will regress, if you like, by default. So as Jill said, of course, the EU has crossed the T's and dotted the I's and released its proposed deal in May. I think it probably wanted more ambitious language, and the word ambition in the final agreement rather than net zero target as an objective perhaps wasn't exactly what the EU wished, but ultimately that's what it got. And I think to some that's a little bit disappointing. Just to finish up on a couple of other issues, apart from fish, the level playing field was something that was very starkly prominent with regards to the negotiations, and this, of course, refers to the argument from the European Union that maintaining the goodies, maintaining tariff-free and quota-free trade requirements requires rules on fair competition. Well, what does that mean, in terms of climate change? It means maintaining an equivalence. It means ensuring that heavy polluting industries like steel or cement, for example, in both the UK and the EU side, have to take on the same measures, possibly very expensive measures, to curb emissions in order to prevent one from, necessarily undercutting the other with cheaper, dirtier products. And one of those mechanisms, of course, is non-regression, no sliding back, a non-regression mechanism that prevents all parties to the deal from weakening environmental standards from those initial EU levels as a whole. So in terms of going forward, Jill's already talked a little bit about the global governance that we're going to see and the opportunities for Britain in COP26. I think beyond that, there are a range of other conventions and accords that Britain might like to look at. It hasn't, for example, yet signed up to the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, ACCTS. That's the one that binds 6 countries, including Switzerland and New Zealand, driving sustainability through trade, which is in fact a nice echo of some of the leitmotifs you find in the TCA. Equally, at the same time, Britain is a signatory to a host of international agreements which cover polluting goods and actions, like the Rotterdam or the Basel and the Stockholm agreements on pollutants. I think those are good examples of global governance at work that support where Britain hopefully is going as a result of the TCA. Missed opportunities, finally, might be, in a sense, those rolled over bilateral relationships with individual countries where environment and climate change are a key part of them, but they've not actually been they've not been rolled over. So agreements that Britain had with third countries that it had access previously under EU deals didn't necessarily seize those as a chance to improve on the agreement's green credentials. And some have very little or even no sustainability commitments. So there's still some work to do. I'll finish there and hand back to Mike. Thank you.
Amelia, many thanks. So I think in the final session, which Anthony Froggatt will be delivering, I think we're going to focus a bit more on the technicalities. So Anthony, again, is known to most, no doubt, particularly as Chatham House are hosting this particular session. But Anthony, together with Caroline Kuzemko at University of Warwick, are the two people who are delivering the UK Brexit project that's behind this behind today's event. And so Anthony's going to talk about a few topics of which he is often heard talking about, the trading emissions system and the issue of interconnection, of electricity interconnection, and issues to do with trade deals and carbon border adjustments. So we've gone from a very general sort of state-of-the-art assessment through to climate and the TCA, Now we're getting into the sort of the nitty-gritty of the energy aspects and infrastructure. So keep the questions coming in. We've got a number of questions there. I'll be delighted to see more. And if you want to address questions to particular speakers, then let us know. So Anthony, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks very much, Mike. And Jill, Amelia, thank you for your opening statements. Yeah, in terms of what I'd just like to cover, I'll skip over some of the introductory issues, because in particular, Jill mentioned some of these, but just worth reiterating that the UK is seen to be a global leader in terms of climate change policy and the setting of targets. And I think there was a great quote by Lord Deben this week as the Committee on Climate Change. He's the chair of the Committee on Climate Change. They were doing their sort of annual assessment of how the government is doing. And he said the government, he gave it 9 out of 10 for the setting of targets and 4 out of 10 for meeting them. And I think that's one of the key issues. We have got the UK setting June 2019 net zero. Amelia mentioned the NDC, the 68% below 1990 levels. Actually, before the Biden climate summit in April of this year, the UK announced a 78% cut in emissions by 2035. So really quite radical. I mean, and if we meet them, this is really on the way to net zero. But, and the big but, of course, is, are we going to meet them? And the question is the extent to which we are outside of the EU, we are tying our hands somewhat in terms of our ability to meet some of these emissions. And maybe I'll touch upon some of these areas that I think, while it may not permanently tie our hands to, we need to think about this as we're going to net zero, because some of the systems and our ability to work on emissions cuts were intricately linked to the EU. And the first one, as Jill mentioned, the emissions trading scheme. So the UK was the founder of emissions trading system, and the EU ETS was built and modelled on the UK domestic system. And there was lots of backwards and forwards of A, would we stay in the system as we left in the EU ETS? Would we set up our own system? Or potentially would we have a carbon tax? And it was only announced in December of last year, just as we were leaving, that we would in fact have our own emissions trading system. That is now up and running. The carbon price, I checked this morning, is roughly the same between the EU's and the UK, so around 55 euros a tonne, relatively healthy, obviously far better than it was for many years in the low teens or even lower, wasn't significant to drive things. And in part, the reason we have a higher carbon price is there is optimism, or there is a belief that within the EU and the UK, that there will be further tightening of the system, that there'll be more measures, and that we are being serious about decarbonisation. And I think that is an important thing for us to bear in mind. 2 more things just to mention in terms of the ETS. One is the question of the scope of the UK's ETS. When it's announced, the government said this is, and I quote, the world's first net zero emissions trading system. And that in due course, we will work out how to align the cap with the appropriate net zero trajectory. So it may well expand to other sectors, and we need to see the cap going down. So I think this is a really important thing for us to watch, is how radical is the UK's emissions trading system. And the second, of course, is will we eventually link to the EU's? And there was talk earlier this year about maybe this would be one of the announcements in COP26. Jill was talking about the need for cooperation in the run up to this. So maybe that would be a signal of that. I'm personally not convinced that will happen. I think it's probably too early. I think people want to see how the UK's emissions trading system is working, but maybe it will be linked sometime in the future. So the first is emissions trading. The second, as Mike mentioned, I hope with some sort of respect, rather than I'm quite boring in terms of talking about interconnectors the whole time, but I do think they're important. It is a real signal and a symbol of the difference that now exists between the UK and the EU as we're outside it. We still have electricity and gas throwing through the pipes and wires, but it's now done under a different regime. So that there's different legal structures, and in fact, there's different operational regimes. And in summary, in terms of the power grids, we are operating these less efficiently. And that puts a marginal price difference in terms of the electricity that's traded across. But for me, that's not the most important thing. The important thing is about decarbonisation, is what is key within grids in the future is flexibility. We know that we will have more renewables on the grid, and in particular wind and solar, variable renewables, and then we need to be able to move electricity around in order to match the production and supply that comes out of those. So being able to operate the interconnectors so that they can switch electricity trade backwards and forwards at short notice is absolutely crucial. And that will become more difficult as we go forward. So yeah, it's very clear that this is a material impact because we are no longer in the internal energy market. It is also impacting to some degree in the confidence in the construction of new interconnectors. Under the EU, there was a target, or there still is a target, but obviously no longer applies to the UK, that at minimum there must be 10% of peak power demand being able to be met by interconnectors. And because of that, the UK had put in place really quite radical or quite significant proposals to increase the volume of or the number of interconnectors. And that has gone up. We have built a couple more since we've left, actually, or they've been completed, but some have also been suspended. So we are seeing a slight reduction in the likely construction of interconnectors. That may be temporary, but I would just flag it as an important impact that we have already seen in terms of the emissions trading system. Two other very quick areas. One is just research and development and finance. So looks like the UK, Jill will probably correct me, or Amelia correct me, that we will become part of Horizon Europe. I don't know if that has actually happened. Anyway, but that's great. We'll remain part of the research and development program of the EU. But in other areas, we will lose the ability to finance. In particular, things like the European Investment Bank, 80% of its lending goes to its members. We are no longer a member state. So yeah, as they increasingly fund carbon initiatives. So they've announced in 2020 a 24 billion euro fund specifically for climate change. Yeah, obviously we're no longer part of that. So there will be reduction in ability to get finance for climate change issues and other issues like the Connecting Europe facility. But maybe if I could just finish with mentioning the carbon border tax adjustment, because I think this is really important, in particular from an EU perspective, and it will be therefore interesting. And I see that there's some questions around in the chat about this. Yeah, the TCA recognizes the importance, as both Amelia and Jill have mentioned, of climate change. It doesn't mention anything about carbon border tax adjustments. And in July of this year, the Commission, so next month, is going to publish its proposals in this area. And these are designed to stop carbon leakage. So equipment that is produced in carbon, using energy that has high carbon content, as the equipment is then imported into the EU, there will be a adjustment in terms of a tax that would then go to the EU in order to stop the movement, to stop people moving companies outside the EU because of the higher carbon price. So is an important issue. It's a very high political issue in terms of some of the countries like the United States is very nervous about it. The UK has said it recognizes its importance, but it has yet to really, in some ways, put its flag in terms of what direction it wants to go in this area. But I would, highlight this as an area of contention that we should all look for, both in terms of when the EU announces its position, but also going forward, because I think it is an important issue. And in the same way that the EU ETS initially was very ineffective because the price was too low, it certainly helped in terms of carbon nitricizing, that's a word, companies from all over Europe. So I think the carbon border tax adjustment mechanism may well be relatively ineffective to begin with, but I think it will encourage people to think about carbon pricing, not just in the EU, but in countries all over the world. And my final point is, I just agree in terms of the importance of COP26. And I would slightly disagree with Jill. It is supposed to be a joint COP between the Italians and the Brits. So I do see that they are working together in this, not just because of the G7 and the G20, but because they are jointly on the hook for it. The UK obviously is hosting it, But I think if it is seen as a failure, and I do think after the G7, things are less optimistic. I don't think the G7 moved things forward as much as people would have hoped. It won't just be the UK that looks bad. I think the EU as a whole will as well. So thanks very much indeed.
Thanks, Anthony. Interconnectors are never boring. And as you know, I have my own interest in the gas interconnectors. And I would say that there's also a parallel UKERC project underway at the moment looking at LNG and gas security, where the question we're asking really is, what is needed to keep the UK as a competitive destination for LNG cargoes coming into Europe? Because of course, the UK terminals are in competition with those on the European mainland, and they're an important part of keeping our gas interconnectors in business. So I think there are lots of issues around interconnection more generally. Okay, so thank you very much. We've finished our first element, bang on time, and we do have a set of questions, but it's going to take a bit of balancing here to get questions distributed. But the one that's been, and I'm not going to mention people's names because this is being recorded for later broadcast, so I won't be mentioning who's asked what questions for issues of data security, obviously. So the issue of rebalancing mechanisms of the TCA, and in particular, the fact that some measures are introduced by either side, I guess, to address climate change could create significant divergence on trade. And the carbon border adjustment mechanism is the one that has been raised as a potential source of friction. And one person asks, if the EU introduces it, does the UK have to? And I guess if we started with Jill and then heard from Amelia and Anthony, because you've all commented on this. So Jill, a climate ambition, a source of friction, the carbon adjustment, your thoughts on that?
I think there is a big risk of climate becoming a bit of a source of contention. The UK government would, I think, say, look, our nationally determined contribution is more ambitious than the EU's. And the UK, delivers on its climate promises, even if the Climate Change Committee is sceptical about whether we're heading in the right direction on upcoming carbon budgets. And I think the risk that I see, but I'd be very interested in Amelia's views on this, is if the EU judges that the UK is falling behind on this, that will play out extremely badly here. Relations are very sort of awkwardly posed and very, very sensitive. And I think if and we've seen this, we saw this, I think, early on in the skirmishes over vaccines, with the sense that the EU was dissing the AstraZeneca vaccine because it was a British vaccine. I think we'll probably see more of that actually in some ways from the US at the moment, but anyway, but that it was particularly singling this out. And some countries were taking aim at things because they didn't want Britain to be given credit or to have any sort of successes. And I think there was a real worry, if the perception takes hold in the UK that the EU is rubbishing our efforts on climate change because we're the UK and because they can't be seen to be giving us credit for what we're doing. And I think that's a really difficult, sensitive thing. So I had this slight nightmare scenario down the line, very interesting what Anthony thinks, where the EU starts with, our great success. What's the great success of the TCA? Well, it's tariff-free, quota-free. But if we start seeing tariffs creeping back in as a carbon border adjustment mechanism, then, and they apply to something British, then I think this could get quite nasty. But that may be a total misreading. So I want to hand over to Anthony and Amelia. But at the moment, and I think this is one of the important long run things about the UK's relationship with the EU, at the moment, every relationship with the EU, almost every relationship, we seem to have carved it off in some security stuff, is seen through the prism of Brexit, almost on both sides, that the UK sees it through the prism of Brexit, and some people for their own purposes, in particular President Macron, need to see things as showing why Brexit was a stupid error and inflicted on the British public by mendacious people of whom the Prime Minister is public enemy number one. And I think we need to get away from the fact that we need to sort of move beyond seeing every EU-UK interaction through the prism of, does this mean Brexit was a good idea or does it mean Brexit was a terrible idea? And then we can have much more sensible conversations. But I think we're quite a long way away from that at the moment. Handing over to the others for more expert.
Amelia?
I don't disagree. I think at this point it is quite a polarized debate. Brexit is understood and interpreted as effectively a political loss, materially, existentially, regionally. On the other hand, the chance of having a win, regional climate ambitions, that's a political gain. I think the EU is at pains to point out the root causes of Brexit, are as much a fault as how it actually wound up transpiring. So I think they want to try to make darn sure that those root causes don't, aren't embedded too much in the EU. And I'm afraid, to be honest, many of them already are. With regards to the tricky role that the level playing field played, I found that was a really sharp crystallization of the most fractious part of the UK and the EU. Exactly as Jill said, we want the free this and the free that, and well, you can have it, but you can have it on our basis and our rules and our terms, etc. And eventually they met in the middle. I guess the key is, who watches the watchers, who decides how a non-regression mechanism, which prevents all parties from chipping away and weakening their environmental standards from those initial levels signed on from the 1st of January 2021. Who decides? We understand the architecture of the governance, which Jill alluded to at the beginning. But there's whole areas, I think, if you read it, that are very, very unclear. The idea that climate policies need to be maintained whether or not deregulation impacts the economy. It's very, very tricky. Greener UK, for example, have written on this. The commitment to non-regression only applies to cases affecting trade and investment, which is notoriously difficult to prove. That's extraordinarily tough to iron out, I think, in material terms. The question itself is on the concept of rebalancing. So the final deal, of course, includes rebalancing. Those are measures which mean that if the UK does not keep pace, falls away, either deliberately or not, with EU emissions standards, then the bloc can take action by imposing tariffs. And it's the sort of tit for tat tariff use in terms of something that's much more unprovable. That's going to be very, very difficult. Let me hand over to Anthony if he wants to take a swing at carbon border adjustment mechanisms.
Is that right, Mike?
Yeah, very quickly.
Yeah, I'm just one thing, just in terms of rebalancing, it is worth noting, again, I mean, the energy sector, is that there is a review process in which then the relationship will be looked at again in 2026, and not that long away. And so I think that's quite interesting. I would agree with what the others have said in terms of this slightly more confrontational issue approach that currently exists. But I wonder, in 5 years' time, we've got different administrations. It doesn't even have to be different parties, but just the people have changed. Will there be a different relationship as you renegotiate in these different sectors? Maybe energy becomes less contentious. Maybe the UK does rejoin the internal energy market and we do get more efficient trading. Again, thank you very much over the interconnectors. Because nobody really cares politically. How do we trade electricity? So I could see that rebalancing approach over time, maybe moving back towards a more cooperative approach in certain regions. In terms of the carbon border tax adjustment mechanisms, just to emphasize what I said, is the current price of carbon in the EU ETS and the UK ETS is around the same. And I think it's probably likely that they will, even if they're not linked, maybe they would, they're relatively similar ambitions that we have. The UK is just slightly higher. But if you look at Germany, Germany has I think it's 65 or 66% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. So it's higher than the EU average. So across the EU as a whole, it's not all equal. It's not all at 55. So I think we're in the same border park. So therefore, I think the price will remain roughly the same. And therefore, I don't see that carbon border tax adjustment mechanisms will apply to the UK in terms of specifics. Two, very final things. One is just, and I don't know what will happen here, but what happens if the UK is importing goods from other countries and then re-importing or exporting them into the EU, if there's a potential there for some sort of mechanism border tax adjustment mechanism for that re-export. And finally, there are various versions of the CBAM paper floating around, leaked versions. And I just saw a very quick graph at it, and I haven't looked into it, but anyway, it's worth flagging. What I saw in terms of the sectors that they're looking at, the UK is second only to Russia in terms of the countries that will be most affected within the sectors that is being flagged. So when the final paper comes out, it'll be worth us having a look at the extent to which the UK's goods, were we not to meet similar carbon pricing, whether or not that would have an impact.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I've got far more questions than we're possibly going to get through in the time we've got.
Sorry.
So, but what I want to do is that there's a whole set of issues that have come up, and I think they actually speak nicely to this issue around sovereignty and kind of whose regulations are best and how one cooperates. So a lot of the sort of difficult to abate issues have come up around, for example, air transport. What would be the UK-EU relationship there, shipping emissions and how they should be accounted for, issues around access to critical minerals, deep sea mining and so forth. But also, of course, the issue of the North Sea, the UK government allowing new licenses and the transition deal for the UKCS and all this kind of stuff. And I think I'm taken by what Jill was saying earlier. I mean, the issue here is that, for these things to be successful, the EU and the UK have to cooperate. But in the context of the kind of Brexit environment, the question is, how do they cooperate? When the UK certainly does not want to be seen to be adopting EU legislation and vice versa. And is there a space in here for sort of nesting the UK-EU relationship in G7 or G20 or whatever, or perhaps a trilateral relationship with the US with the Biden administration? So the whole thing is sort of insulated, as one person put it, insulated from the Brexit conversation. And this is true of COP26. So there are a lot of sticky issues out there. And if anyone wants to comment on those individual issues, air transport, shipping emissions, mining for minerals, oil and gas licenses, methane emissions, again, another one there's a whole set of problems out there. Both sides recognize them as problems, but how do we cooperate without falling into the Brexit trap and concerns over sovereignty? So again, if we could go through give each of you a chance to comment on that. And by the time we've done that, I think we'll have a final sort of wrap-up question at the end. So Jill, your thoughts on these issues of how do you cooperate?
So I think at the moment, and we don't know whether this will last, but I think at the moment, probably the least productive forum is going to be a formal structured UK-EU forum. So the UK, I think, would prefer either genuinely multilaterals or some sort of global. We've seen that on things like tax, where we've seen that sort of G7 accord now going into the G20, see whether anything actually ends up coming of that, or whether UK was always resistant to EU cooperation on tax, happy to talk in the OECD because it said it wasn't the right set of countries in the EU, or other issues. And we're seeing some of this as a fallout of the TCA and trying to paper over some of the cracks in the TCA, doing bilateral deals. One of the things I think about the emphasis on sovereignty is that so David Frost's view, I'm not sure he quite put it like this, put words in his mouth, is in a sense the EU is an over-assertive player, and that it's a slightly illegitimate player, and the UK has preferences either for other groupings that reflect our wider worldview, or to do bilateral deals with individual member states, and we might see more of that. So I think sort of immediate progress, probably easiest, the least relevant a formal EU forum is. Then we have seen some cooperation on, following things on sanctions and some foreign policy things. And David Frost last week didn't rule out foreign policy cooperation, just said we just don't need a big EU structure with EU structure, formal pre-scheduled summits and things like that all over it.
Amelia, your thoughts?
Thank you. I could totally agree with trying to sort of insulate from Brexit. My thoughts went back when Anthony mentioned Horizon Europe to what existed before that. And this is the sort of interreg regional-based, project-led constructions on a whole host of climate change and climate finance and climate ambitions, many of them predisposed to build infrastructure, critical infrastructure on either side, and regions and counties, in fact, working very successfully and cooperatively together. So I possibly optimistically would think that that's actually a nice method by which to perhaps depoliticize a highly charged EU-UK forum at this point. So project-led on the basis of needs, and using matched funding and sort of really trying to, drag in and not altogether uncooperative private sector. Yes, of course, we can't get, loans from the European Investment Bank, but matched funding, certainly I think, von der Leyen is very, very keen to find reasonable regional partners in Britain to cooperate in terms of her EU Green Deal. So that, perhaps matched with bilateral and trilateral opportunities, are very much the way forward, I think.
Thank you for that, Anthony.
Yeah, it's a long list of different topics.
I know.
It was a bit of a basket.
You could pick on one or two of them.
I guess. Yeah, it just. When we're talking about shipping and airlines, obviously these are cross-border issues, and there is a relationship for the UK and the EU to sort out. But there is equally, in particular in the case of aviation, for that to be addressed with other parts of the world. And I think that in some ways, therefore, the best for that isn't the UK EU, but it is on the global level. And we have COP26. This is a perfect opportunity for the UK to be pushing some of these issues. If you look at the way in which the UK is running its COP26, it is running these particular focused campaigns, and transport is there. But the main issue that they're pushing on transport is on EVs, and let's roll out EVs. So it's clearly aviation always is a sticky issue. I think for politicians, it's probably second only to meat in terms of them saying, well, in order to address these issues, it's difficult. Everyone should be allowed to go on holiday. Everyone should be allowed to have their burgers all the time. But yet we know there are constraints. And so it's difficult for UK politicians and EU politicians to address this. But I would just say it obviously needs to be addressed. Transport is 12% of global emissions, so we have to address them. And I would say, do it in a multilateral forum. And finally, just in terms of the North Sea, it was mentioned in terms of licenses. It's also worth mentioning in terms of things like the North Sea Grids Initiative. It's one of the big successes that there was, cooperation between the Nordics, the UK, Ireland, etc. And one hopes that will continue. It's obviously been slowed down because of Brexit, but if we are going to have lots of offshore wind, which makes sense for the UK, makes sense for Ireland, many of the Benelux countries, etc., then a clear example of a cooperation is a win-win situation. So I hope that gets back on track.
We did actually have a question, Anthony, for you, which was around the meshed grid, but there's also a question for you around economic growth. And in some ways, what are the right economic policies needed to grow the UK economy enough to make progress on net zero? But it's perhaps also a more general issue about regulation and trade friction and flows of investment that we need to ensure that we create an environment where the private sector can invest. And it comes back to my comments earlier about LNG, that the UK needs to be seen as an attractive place for international investment in clean tech. We've seen some investments in recent weeks in the car industry, for example, around this space and around gigafactories. So it's trying to come up with an economic growth strategy aligned to net zero that's not going to be undermined by the legacies of Brexit friction as they continue. So I think what your comments sort of speak to that. One of the other questions that's come up is around the mixed message between being global Britain and then cutting foreign aid. Does that have an impact on the leadership ability of the UK when it comes to climate actions? Does anyone like to comment on that?
Yeah, well, I hosted a panel event when we had a Net Zero Day at the Institute for Government. I did the panel with the climate change negotiators, and one of the questions was, does the government's decision at that stage to go ahead with the Cumbria coal mine undermine its run into net zero, run into the COP. And the German climate negotiator, obviously Germany's got a coal issue as well, but the German negotiator said, no, what undermines it is your 0.7% and ditching that commitment. And one of the things that's absolutely clear, you know, somebody I think in the Q&A asked what will make a successful COP. Climate finance mobilization, making good on the money that was promised in Paris that hasn't arrived yet, appears to be a necessary, if not a sufficient precondition for actually sort of, you know, making some progress there. So I think it's very difficult for the UK to go around and encourage others to contribute when it is known that around the developing world, the UK is having to slash back a lot of commitments because of the way it's implemented this 8 cut, because it's done it in a sort of very rushed way, which means that uncommitted programs, even ones, you know, in middle underway, have to be cut because they're the sort of available cash that can go. And, you know, some of the bilateral aid cuts, you know, don't look anything like the difference between 0.7 and 0.5% GNI. These are talking really, really deep cuts, program terminations in some of the poorest countries that you want to get on board. And frankly, not countries that are going to be inspired by somebody going around saying, where's your commitment to net zero? Or, you know, decarbonized development and saying, actually, we need to get our people out of poverty first and you're not helping. So I think that's a really difficult issue for Alex Sharma. It'd be very interesting to know what conversations, what he said in the cabinet about the implications for the COP before that decision was made.
Thank you. And you preempted one of the remaining questions about what makes a good COP. So, I mean, I'll ask the other two to comment and also to reflect on this question of, you know, well, I'm sure that that Boris Johnson will claim a success whatever happens, but what do you think, Amelia and Nancy, would signal a positive outcome for COP? What are you looking for? And it shouldn't go to penalties.
Try not. Just following on from Jill's logic there, I think you're quite right. I think with the pulling of the fund of GCRF and Newton funding in particular, it's going to be difficult for the UK to, you know, retain its identity as the broker, as the leader, because I think it's undermined at a stroke. Its commitment, financing of long-term global governance-related, aid-related, very real material needs in the developing world, eroded trust, and also I think if it simply hasn't been forthcoming in terms of both climate finance and development finance, there's going to be very real questions over its ability to, you know, to put its money where its mouth is. So a successful COP is always a combination, as it is in everything to do with diplomacy, of soft power and hard cash. So at this point, I think it needs to try to make good on it. I was possibly cynically hoping that just before COP, the government would make a nice, generous announcement that perhaps it's changed its mind on this. I think that is unlikely. But certainly, I think there's a bit of a chasm in terms of trust and the likelihood of implementation. Thanks.
Anthony?
Yes, money, absolutely. And I think that was one of the I mentioned earlier, the disappointment that came out of the G7. It really was the opportunity for countries to reach this 100 billion. So this was pledged back in Paris that there'd be $100 billion a year from developed countries to developing countries to meet climate mitigation and adaptation targets. Maybe there was increases in pledges from a number of members of the G7, but by no means all. And I think we're probably around 70. It's around 70 billion a year, I think. So they're 70% of the way there, but yeah, it needs to go much more. And I think a lot of countries are also looking at the amount of public sector money that has been found for COVID. And they're saying you can find the hundreds of billions or trillions for COVID, but yet you can't help us in this area. So I think that's really going to be important, as is and it's mixed in with the vaccines. It's the same issue. We were an order of magnitude off in terms of what was needed in the number of vaccines that were being pledged to help the world meet its target. So I do think these two things will be linked. I think the other thing in terms of a successful COP is we are still not there in terms of the Paris climate target itself, in terms of mitigation. We've mentioned UK has done well in terms of its announcement. It's great, 68%. EU has increased its pledges. US came on board, great, 50 to 55% reduction. So much better than Trump, but yet if you add all of these up, the new commitments, they still don't reach the 2.2 degrees, never mind 1.5 degrees. So I think there will be people looking around for other countries to increase their NDCs, and there needs to be more sector work touched upon, EVs, renewables, etc. There needs to be a number of things that underpin the ability for countries to meet their mitigation targets. So it's technology and finance. I see we got 4 minutes. I would throw in something that maybe the others may or may not want to answer, but China, obviously from a climate change perspective, it's absolutely fundamental, third of the world's emissions, etc. Its pledge was really welcomed back in last year in terms of carbon neutrality by 2060. A lot of people are wanting China to go further, but I just wonder how much China is an example of something that may still destabilize the relationship between the UK and the EU. And climate change is one area that we both need China to get on board. So I flagged that as I don't know what the answer is, but I don't know if the others do, or we just leave it hanging for all of the other wonderful panels that exist across London Climate Action Week for them to pick up.
I don't know if either of you want to come in on China very quickly, Annette, before I kind of sum up.
I think just to say what Anthony said, it could yet surprise us. I think it was a very welcome commitment, but whether it wants to be seen to be a reasonable partner and a trustworthy partner, I think the jury's still out on that. If it lines up and promotes a really clustered approach, working with, for example, the European Union on specific areas of very real development. If it wants to contribute and invest in massive amounts of green finance, I mean, that's going to be very, very welcome. But I guess the question is, specifically and politically, at what cost?
Okay, we've had about problems of Europe, UK moving dirty industries offshore, the issue of offshoring. And I guess I'd kind of sum up by sort of saying, I mean, much of our discussion has revealed, I think, is that on the one hand, there is a danger that this relationship between the UK and the UK and this focus on sovereignty, particularly on the UK side, can make it very difficult to arrive at sensible solutions based on cooperation, because there's trying to work out whose idea was it and whose regulations will be put into place. But there's also a danger that what is presented in the European Union in the name of green taxes and regulations and carbon border mechanisms or whatever, if the impact of those falls disproportionately on the UK, then the UK will see that in a Brexit context, even though that might have not been the design. I guess we talked about China, and I think that, and also the cuts to foreign aid, I would, trying to be global Britain comes with responsibilities and challenges, and perhaps we need to recognise that. And the cuts were not something that was a very good idea. I think most would agree. The one country we haven't mentioned is the United States. And I think the UK again has a difficult balancing act, because it obviously wants to talk up the special relationship, but certainly when it comes to energy and when it comes to issues like trade in natural gas, there are particular frictions between the Biden administration in the United States and the European Union around the pipeline Nord Stream 2, but also the impact, for example, that a carbon border mechanism might have on US LNG, given that the upstream source is shale gas. And of course, the UK itself has a fractious relationship with Russia, as was made quite apparent this week. So I think how do you balance those things, I think is really, really interesting, really important, and how you can actually somehow de-Brexitify, if that's a word, cooperation around climate and making progress in the run up to COP26, because it would be, if COP26 became a sort of a hostage to ongoing antagonisms around the TCA and so forth, that would be very unfortunate. So thank you very much to our presenters for your presentations and responses to the questions. Many thanks to everyone who's joined us today. We've had well over 100 at the peak. It's now starting to die off quite naturally. Hopefully we have answered just about every question, if not all. But if you are interested in the ongoing work of this particular project funded by UKIRK, then visit the UKIRK website, but also obviously the work that's going on at Chatham House in this space. So I wish you well. Someone asked who's going to win, Germany or England. I couldn't possibly comment. And I say thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.